So would you agree with me that happiness is something that is important to most people? Yes. Okay. Would you agree that most people are looking for happiness in life? Yeah. Would you agree that some are better at it than others? Yeah. Okay. Would you also then agree that it could be said that part of life is a journey toward discovering what happiness is, how to attain it, how to expand it, broaden it, experience it? I think so. You know, there's a book that came out some years ago that was called The Art of Happiness, and it was written actually by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and a person named Howard Cutler. Howard Cutler is a psychiatrist and a friend who interviewed His Holiness extensively so that he could write the book, and they dialogued on it. And some of you may be familiar with it, but in the very first few lines, we find His Holiness saying, "I believe the very purpose of life is to seek happiness." He said, whether one believes in religion or not, whether one believes in this or that religion, we all are seeking something better in life. And he concludes by saying, so I think that the very motion of life, not emotion, but the motion of life is towards happiness. In other words, the movement of consciousness, I think, is what he was really alluding to. And this is also, of course, what it is that our great master teacher, Jesus Christ, taught us as well, that we are meant to be happy. He believed that the reasons for his sharing his truth and his teachings were basically to promote happiness, to promote joy. Joy and happiness are synonymous. You may recall in the Gospel of John where Jesus himself said, "These things that I have spoken to you, these things that I have taught you, are that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full." And so we can assume that Jesus was kind of a happy, joyous guy, because he says he wants that joy that he experienced, that bliss that was moving through him. He wants that which was his to be ours, and not just in a partial way, but for it to be full, and meaning that we leave our experiences of emptiness and begin to experience a sense of happiness and joy moving through us. And that's where, of course, living the truth, knowing the truth that sets us free from everything that would keep us from being happy, enters in. And so in Unity, I think we recognize that revelation and insight and spiritual inspiration can come from more than one place and from more than one person. Certainly we respect and follow the teachings of Jesus Christ, but we also recognize that there were those who were enlightened, who preceded him, and those who have insight who followed him as well, that have some interesting things to say. A person like His Holiness, though we do not hold him up at the level of Jesus Christ, we certainly respect him, as he's won the respect around the world for the way he has taught and lived and demonstrated a universal love and compassion, and taught a message really about us coming together as one. And one of the things that endeared me to Unity, actually, and becoming a minister, not the only thing, but one of them that was very impactful for me, was that Unity really seeks to unite rather than separate, and that it seeks to respect all paths and all world religions and recognize similarities as opposed to just differences, and acknowledge that other religions have value, and there is a commonality and a common thread oftentimes, and that there is not just one way to the top of the mountain, that there are many ways to get to the top of the mountain. And the top of the mountain, yes, is God, and that's the goal. The goal is the same, which is to get to the top where you find oneness. And when you get to the top and find oneness, you realize nothing separated us. We were all one to begin with. All right? So Unity is a Christian church focused foremost on the Christ teachings, but it's important that we not ever close ourselves off from what is to be shared from others that complement our teachings as well. In fact, interestingly enough, His Holiness in that book, The Art of Happiness, talked about this very thing. And the way he said it was this. He said, "I believe that each individual should embark upon a spiritual path that is best suited to his or her mental disposition, natural inclination, temperament, belief, family, and cultural background. For myself, I found Buddhism is best. But that does not mean Buddhism is best for everyone. That would be foolish. He said, we must respect and appreciate the value of all the different major world religious traditions. All these religions can make an effective contribution for the benefit of humanity. They're all designed to make the individual a happier person and the world a better place. And he next points out how important it is for every individual in their respective path to practice those teachings, whatever they may be. That essentially at the core it really is about love and oneness. And yes, we can pick out a path here or there where there has gone into extremism or there's been a distortion, but at the core of most all world religions there is a purity that brings love and oneness together. Now in Buddhism it has been taught that, well, there's a belief in suffering. And His Holiness says that there is really no avoiding the fact that suffering is a part of life. And of course he's talking about anything from worry and anxiety or fear to, pains that we go through emotionally and physically as well. But he says there's no avoiding the fact that suffering is a part of life. And he says, of course, we have a natural tendency to dislike our suffering and problems. He says, but I think that ordinary people don't view the very nature of our existence to be characterized by suffering. In other words, it's not all suffering. And then the Dalai Lama, he begins to laugh. And if you've never been around him, I've had the good fortune to be around him several times, very closely. And he starts laughing, and it's magic. And anyway, he says, I mean, on your birthday, people usually say happy birthday, when actually the day of your birth was the birth of your suffering. He says, but nobody says happy birth of suffering day. Love that man. And Christianity cannot deny that life holds some suffering, even if we want to minimize the amount that we may encounter in life. Jesus went to the cross. And Jesus spoke to the idea of suffering as well. And he said, in the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer, I've overcome the world. And what he's saying that is in the world you're going to be faced with problems and circumstances and situations that aren't fun, they're not pleasant, they're uncomfortable. But be of good cheer, there is a way through it. There is a way beyond it. And that's what these spiritual teachings are, is to help you to rise above, have the strength, all of those teachings that are very, very powerful and can help in guidance steer you around a lot of the suffering that doesn't have to be. The human part of us has perhaps the suffering, whereas the divine part, the more we move to the divine part and really understanding truth and incorporating and integrating it, the less suffering we really have. And that's a big part of it. So he's saying that, in this world we have these circumstances. And, we as human beings have in many ways devised a vast repertoire of strategies to avoid having to experience whatever varying degrees of suffering or difficulty and avoiding problems. Sometimes, people have used drugs and chemicals and excess in alcohol and other things to medicate and deaden the pain or the suffering that one may be feeling and wanting to avoid internally. And we may think there is a solution to a problem, and sometimes the solution becomes the problem, and sometimes the solution we pick may be even a bigger problem than the solution to the problem we're trying to avoid. You get the drift? An extreme example is actually some years back, I remember in the news, there was a guy who had serious financial problems, and the news reported about him, and he also had disability insurance that would pay him up to $470,000 if he had a disability. And so I know this is wild, but he actually had a friend chop off his arm. And I don't know how you could get a friend to do that, but it was to escape the suffering associated with his financial problems and having people think and find out that he was a failure. And he got found out, the news reported that while he was still recovering in the hospital, he was being accused of fraud. And so in the end, not only did he not collect on the money, he was minus an arm, and he did some time. And all because basically he did not want to face the suffering associated with looking like a failure. It's interesting to note the Dalai Lama's approach to human suffering. Although he believes that there is, suffering in life, and believes in he also believes in the possibility of freedom from suffering, that you can get beyond it and around it. But he says it starts with accepting suffering as a fact of human existence, that you're going to bump up against some situations in life, and that it's important that you courageously face these things and problems head on. And sometimes, like I say, suffering is a heavy word, and it can be no more than simply fears that we have, or worries, or anxieties, or what have you. His Holiness states, if your basic outlook is that suffering is negative and must be avoided at all costs, and in some sense is a sign of failure, he said this will add a distinct psychological component of anxiety and intolerance when you encounter difficult circumstances, a feeling of being overwhelmed. On the other hand, he said, if your basic outlook accepts that suffering is a natural part of your existence, this will undoubtedly make you more tolerant towards the adversities of life. And without a certain degree of tolerance towards your suffering, your life becomes miserable. He said, then it's like having a very bad night, and that night seems eternal. It never seems to end. So he's saying that basically problems come to all of us, okay? And not all problems have to cause us a lot of suffering, really. It's how we interface with those problems or situations or circumstances, how we perceive them, how it is that we frame them within the framework of our own consciousness will often dictate how long that problem will be with us, what impact it will have on us, whether or not we really do suffer, and how much we are giving it the power to take away our happiness. There was a girl, mom and dad, who had their daughter off to college, the first child to go off to college. And she was there in the fall, and they got one letter back from her after she'd been there a few weeks and said, essentially, all is well. And then they didn't hear from her for a number of weeks, and it was nearing the time where the semester was up, and they were going to have a break, and she'd be coming home. And then all of a sudden they got a letter from her, and kind of an update. And the letter to them went like this: Mom and Dad, dear Mom and Dad, I'm sorry I haven't written lately, but you see, all my things were destroyed in the dorm fire, and my burns are being treated, and my eyes are almost completely healed now, and the doctors assure me there will be no permanent damage from the smoke. While the dorm is being rebuilt, I have moved in with my new boyfriend. I know how much you've always wanted grandchildren, so you'll be happy to know I'm expecting a baby this summer. Please excuse this exercise in English composition. There is no dorm fire, no burns, and my eyes are not damaged. I'm not living with my boyfriend, and I'm not pregnant. However, I did receive a D in English and an F in physics. And I wanted you to be sure you got this information in proper perspective. Your loving daughter. So again, it's all in how we frame things. That D and F probably went down a lot easier. It's not realistic to think that we're going to be happy all the time with our various situations and circumstances that we face in life. Even Jesus wept. We go through things. Feelings come up. It's very human. Things happen. We experience losses in life, and we have painful experiences. And the important thing is that we not camp out in them, that we don't go to that low place and remain there, The scripture says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow. Walk through, not set up camp. Get out of there. We're all going to walk through shadowy times, difficult circumstances, but walk through it. Don't stay put. The Dalai Lama, when asked if there were any situations in his life that he regretted, he shared about a time when there was an older monk that came and sought out his guidance. This older monk was a hermit, and he came to him and he asked the Dalai Lama about a particular high-level esoteric process that he wanted to do and had learned about based on his spiritual path. And His Holiness said that it was a very difficult task and better to be undertaken by someone who was younger. That it usually was a practice that one started when in their teens. And so the monk went away, and later His Holiness said he found out that the monk had killed himself in order to be reborn in a younger body so as to better take up that deep esoteric process. And so they asked him, well, how did you get rid of the regret? And his response was, I didn't get rid of it. It's still there. It isn't associated with a feeling of heaviness or a quality of pulling me back. It would not be helpful to anyone if I let that feeling of regret weigh me down, be a source of discouragement and depression with no purpose, or interfere with going on with my life to the best of my ability. In other words, it's kind of like things do happen. We do have regrets, but don't camp out there. So there's no purpose in that. Learn something from it and go forward so you're able to give the best of your life going forward. You don't lock into something that if you had it to do over, you might do it differently. But now you know, now you've learned. It's very important. And he too has gone through those experiences and learned along his path. He talked about loved ones, and the loss of loved ones. And he spoke of losing his mother, who he said was his most respected tutor. And also he talked about the loss of one of his brothers. One time having lunch with His Holiness, I was sitting next to his older brother. It was wonderful to talk and meet him. But His Holiness said, initially, of course, feelings of grief and anxiety are a natural human response to a loss. But if you allow these feelings of loss and worry to persist, there's a danger. If these feelings are left unchecked, they can lead to a kind of self-absorption, a situation where the focus becomes all on one's own self. So he's clearly saying that ongoing guilt, ongoing regret, ongoing remorse, whatever, has no purpose. Move out of that. Pick up your tent and move on. The Apostle Paul had some interesting things to say about the idea that we are to learn really through our trials and tribulations and problems. In one situation, there's a passage, I believe, in Acts where it tells about Paul being stoned in a particular city, and they dragged him out of the city and supposing that he was dead. And eventually all of the disciples gathered around him, and somehow he got up and gathered himself, and what he did was to return to the city. And it talks about the idea that symbolically he wasn't allowing anything that had to do with a bit of suffering or discomfort to keep him from going back at the mission that he was called to be about. And that he was actually really teaching the disciples in that moment as well. And trying to strengthen the souls of the disciples, exhorting them to continue in the faith, to not be stymied so easily. Very powerful. And Paul felt that, a certain amount of difficulty or suffering actually builds character. You can read in the book of Romans where he says very powerfully, he says, we rejoice in our sufferings. I don't know that I can ever have you agree with rejoicing over suffering. I have trouble going there too. But nevertheless, he went on to say, we rejoice in our sufferings knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. And so what he's saying there is, it's about love. And he's not saying that we are to go out looking for problems or looking for more suffering to enter into by any means, but that through the trials and tribulations that are natural and come to us in life, that we can build our spiritual character, actually. A spiritual character that insists on staying open to love, to compassion, to forgiveness, which are natural to us, which are natural to the Holy Spirit moving through you as a vehicle of God. And that's what he's saying. Essentially, he comes down to his equation is that, love is happiness. And if you allow anything to squelch love, whether it be suffering or difficulty or challenges or this or that, whatever, if that cancels out love, you forget the happiness. And that's the point that he's making in a very powerful way. And he's saying, some of his wonderful passages where he says that nothing separate us from love. He makes that so emphatic. He asks the question, who or what shall separate us from love? He asks, shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or peril, or the sword? And he says, no. In all these, he says, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am sure, and I love this where he says, for I am sure, it's not doubtful, for I am sure that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. So this is what Jesus taught as well. It's what Paul taught, and it's the idea of having the tenacity to not allow anything to stop you from being love. It's basically learning to become a larger container for love. Happiness is about learning to not get lost in the valley, as we've said, and not to get lost in small perceptions of what may be immediately in front of you that you're dealing with. It's not becoming self-absorbed, and it's not allowing circumstances to make you small. It's staying large in your faith and in your love and in your perspective. So a wonderful story about a Hindu master. He was an older Hindu master, and he grew tired of his apprentice monk who was always complaining. And so one morning he told the monk to go get some salt. And when the apprentice returned, he said, okay, take this handful of the salt and put it in a glass of water. And he did. And then he told him to drink from it. And he did. And the master asked, well, how does the water taste? And he was spitting it out and said, it's bitter. And then the master chuckled and asked the young man to take an equivalent handful of salt and put it and go to the edge of a lake. And he went with him to the edge of the lake and allowed him to let the salt be released, the handful of salt. And he then asked, okay, now take a drink. And he said, how does it taste? And the young monk said, it's fresh, And so he said, well, did you taste any salt? And he said, no. And at this, the master went over to the young monk, who reminded him of himself when he was young, always complaining, maybe seeing things in kind of a bitter light. And he took his hands in his own, and he said to him, the pain of life is pure salt, no more, no less. And the amount of pain in life remains the same, exactly the same. But the amount of bitterness we taste depends on the container we put the pain in. So when you're in pain, he said, the only thing you can do is to enlarge your sense of things. And I love this line, stop being a glass, become a lake. So whatever is in front of you, whatever it is you're dealing with, stop being a glass and become a lake. Most people live their life from a very small container. And we have to expand whatever may be happening in front of us, whatever it is that our eyes may want to fall upon. Expand become a lake. You know, most people look at the external world and they hear all of the different voices that say, take this to be happy, wear this to be happy, drive this to be happy, live here to be happy, eat this, smell like this, join this, buy this, do this, on and on. And there's nothing wrong with, you know, being in this physical world and having these nice things by any means. But many of the times we have to undo and unlearn a lot of the things which are habits and conditioning that think they are the prescription for happiness. Much of becoming happy is a prescription for unlearning things. I want to give you a prescription for unhappiness so that you see what not to do or what you need to unlearn. See if you see yourself anywhere in this. So, prescription for unhappiness. Make little things bother you. Don't just let them, make them. 2, get yourself a good worry, one about which you can't do anything but worry. Lose your perspective of things and keep it lost. Don't put first things first. 4, be a perfectionist. Condemn yourself and others for not achieving perfection. 5, be right. Always right. I know the elbows are coming out already here on that one. Perfectly right all the time. Be the only one who is right. Be rigid about your rightness. 6, don't trust or believe people or accept them at anything but their worst and weakest. 7, always compare yourself unfavorably to others. 8, take personally with a chip on your shoulder everything that happens to you that you don't like. 9, don't give yourself wholeheartedly or enthusiastically to anyone or anything. Well, 2 or 3, 4, I don't know. What do we have to unlearn? What is the path of happiness, people? Number 1, it's recognizing that it's not content. It's really about the depth of our love and our love for life, our love for the being a vehicle through which God is moving. One of the